On the night of March 24th, 2001, 6 people went to bed in an upstairs flat in the Scottish town of Irvine, expecting nothing more than an ordinary night's sleep. Just a few hours later, that home had become an inferno. 3 young women would lose their lives, while 3 others dramatically escaped from a bedroom window. As firefighters battled the blaze, detectives quickly realized this was not a tragic accident. Someone had deliberately started the fire, turning the only escape route into a deadly trap. As the investigation gathered pace, one name kept surfacing. A local man known for his temper and who had spent months intimidating neighbours, making threats and nursing grudges that most people dismissed as drunken nonsense. But when those threats were examined alongside witness accounts, a shocking picture began to emerge that would leave an entire community questioning whether this devastating fire had been an act of revenge disguised as vigilante justice. In this episode of British Murders with Stuart Blues, we're looking at the murders of Carrie Marie Murray, Anna Teresa Murray and Amanda Cooper, and the crimes of Andrew Affleck. It's a case that exposed the deadly consequences of hatred, prejudice, and taking the law into your own hands. Because while Affleck claimed he never intended to kill the people who died that night, the decisions he made left multiple families with a lifetime of heartbreak. A quick one just before we dive in, please make sure you're following British Murders on your podcast player of choice. It is a small action, but it does have a big impact on how far the show travels. Ratings and reviews are always appreciated. And if you want to go a step further, you can join my Patreon. Head to patreon.com/British Murders and you'll gain access to ad-free episodes. You'll get them a day early, and there's also some exclusive content on there. So consider joining my ever-growing community. This episode's story takes us north of the border, all the way up to the North Ayrshire town of Irvine on the west coast of Scotland. Irvine is around 30 miles southwest of Glasgow, where the River Irvine flows into the Firth of Clyde. It's one of Scotland's oldest towns and was once a busy port with shipyards lining the waterfront. For years, it was also home to the huge explosive factory at Ayrshire, which employed thousands of local people. By the early 2000s, though, much of that industry had disappeared. Like plenty of towns across the UK, Irvine had changed. Retail parks had replaced factories, unemployment had hit hard, and many people travelled into places like Glasgow or Kilmarnock each day for work. Around 40,000 people called the town their home, and despite everything, it remained the sort of place where neighbours recognised one another and news travelled fast. One such neighbourhood was Sanderson Avenue, but it wasn't exactly somewhere that made headlines. It was just a bog-standard housing scheme made up of blocks of flats, patches of grass where kids played football despite the signs which read no ball games, and neighbours who mostly kept to themselves. For one family, though, it was simply home. 20-year-old Diane Doherty lived in one of the upstairs flats with her young daughter, Ainsley McDougall, whose age does vary between sources, but she was at most 5 years old. And like any mum, Diane's world revolved around a little girl. Her life wasn't without complications, though. She was in a relationship with someone called John McDougall, who the previous year had been jailed for rape and sentenced to 10 years in prison. Diane had absolutely nothing to do with this crime, by the way, but that didn't stop people putting 2 and 2 together and making 5. In a close-knit community such as that, gossip had a habit of taking on a life of its own. Some people judged Diane purely because of who she was in a relationship with, and before long, she found herself becoming the subject of whispers, rumours, and dirty looks. None of it was deserved, but that didn't make it any easier for her to live with. On the evening of Friday, March 23, 2001, Diane wasn't expecting anything out of the ordinary to happen. Ainsley was at home with her, and some family members had come round to visit. 12-year-old Carrie Marie Murray and her 18-year-old sister Anna Teresa Murray were staying over that night, along with their 20-year-old friend Amanda Cooper. Sleepovers like that were a common occurrence. It was a chance to stay up late, watch TV, have a laugh, and forget about school or work for a few hours. Also in the flat that night was 21-year-old Alexander Parker, a family friend who used a wheelchair. I mention that because it's important later in the story. So that's 6 people in total who'd settled down for the night expecting to wake up the following morning as they always did. None of them could have imagined they were about to become victims of one of the worst deliberately started fires Scotland had seen in years. Just a short distance away lived a 25-year-old called Andrew Affleck, who's better known locally as Drew, but we'll be calling him Affleck for the remainder of the episode. If his neighbours were asked to describe him back then, you'd hear the same sort of things over and over. He had a short fuse, liked to drink, and once he'd had a disagreement with someone, or simply not got on with them, he rarely let it go. Affleck had previously worked as a slaughterman, by which I mean he was paid to kill animals in a slaughterhouse. But by 2001, he was unemployed and living on his own. Most of his days revolved around drinking, stewing over perceived slights, and complaining about the people living around him. Over time, those complaints became something much darker. He convinced himself that certain neighbours were responsible for everything he believed was wrong with the area. The drugs, noise, and antisocial behaviour were examples. In his mind, they were ruining the neighbourhood, and no one seemed to be doing anything about it. In time, his anger became fixated on Diane. Because of her relationship with John, Affleck decided she'd become the symbol of everything he hated. It didn't matter that she'd committed no crime herself, because in his eyes, she didn't belong in Sanderson Avenue. Friends and neighbours later recalled hearing him rant about junkies and rapists, often after he'd been drinking. Sometimes he'd say Diane needed driving out of the town altogether, and other times he'd claim that he'd sort the problem out himself if nobody else stepped up. At first, people brushed it off as drunken nonsense. It's the sort of thing some people say after one drink too many. But as the weeks passed, the threats didn't stop. Affleck began targeting people living in the block. Graffiti appeared, paint was thrown at homes. Residents were shouted at in the street and subjected to abuse whenever they crossed paths with Affleck. He made living there miserable for everyone else, to the point where people complained, incidents were reported, and the police did visit, but nothing really changed. Affleck carried on nursing his grudges, and before long, he began saying something that would later haunt everyone who heard it. He said he was prepared to burn them out, if that's what it took, by which he meant Diane and anyone associated with her. At the time, nobody believed he meant it, but in the space of just a few hours, they would quickly realise he did. The early hours of Saturday, March 24th, 2001 began like any other. The gathering at Diane's the previous evening had gone swimmingly, and like those 6 people there, most of Irvine was asleep. The streets around Sanderson Avenue were quiet, with only the occasional passing car or taxi breaking the silence. Inside the flats, lights had long since been turned off, and families were tucked up in bed, completely unaware that, within minutes, lives would be changed forever. At around 3 o'clock in the morning, Affleck left his flat and made his way over to the entrance of Diane's block. What happened next only lasted a matter of seconds. Affleck took some burning paper and pushed it through the letterbox of the flat's front door before calmly walking away. It sounds almost insignificant, doesn't it? Just a few pieces of burning paper. But the front door was clad in PVC over timber, and later testing would show just how dangerous that combination was. Once it caught alight, the flames spread with frightening speed, as they so often do. Within moments, the door was fully involved, and the only staircase leading out of the upstairs flat essentially became a chimney, forcing thick black smoke and intense heat straight through the building. The first signs that something was wrong came from the crackling of flames and frantic screams echoing throughout the close. Diane woke suddenly, and at first struggled to work out what she'd heard, but it didn't take long for her to catch up. Smoke was already seeping beneath the bedroom door, so instinctively she grabbed Ainsley straight away. Like any parent would, her only thought was saving her little girl, so she opened the bedroom door hoping to reach the stairs, but the heat was unbearable. The hallway had already become an inferno, and there was no way through. Their escape route had disappeared in the matter of minutes. Elsewhere in the flat, panic took over. Carrie, Anna Teresa, Amanda, and Alexander had all been jolted awake by the noise, coughing as thick smoke rapidly filled the rooms around them. Every second that passed made the conditions worse. People often think it's the flames that kill when it comes to house fires, but more often than not, it's the toxic smoke, which, once inhaled, can be fatal. Within minutes, it can leave people completely disorientated, struggling to breathe, unable to find a way out even in a place they know well, and that's exactly what was happening inside the flat. Outside, neighbours awoke to shouting and the sound of glass smashing, with one resident later saying it felt as though the whole block had gone up at once. People rushed outside in their pyjamas, looking up in horror as flames burst from the upstairs windows. Some people dialed 999, whereas others were frozen in their tracks, unable to do little more than watch. Back inside, Diane knew there was only one option left: the window. Her neighbours, recognising the same, gathered beneath it, shouting for her to jump. Standing on the windowsill with flames closing in behind her, Diane made an impossible decision. She threw little Ainsley from the window into the waiting arms of the people below, before jumping herself moments later. It was an extraordinary act of courage, and thankfully both of them survived, although they each suffered serious burns as well as damage from smoke inhalation. Alexander faced an even greater challenge. Being a wheelchair user, escaping a burning upstairs flat was almost impossible. Yet somehow, with the help of the rescuers outside, he managed to get clear of the building. It doesn't state it anywhere specifically, but I'm assuming he also used the window to make his escape. In the process, he too suffered burns and smoke injuries, but against all odds, he survived. Sadly though, not everyone was as fortunate. Fire crews from Irvine and neighbouring Kilmarnock arrived within minutes of the emergency calls, but by then the top floor was already completely engulfed. Firefighters battled the blaze for over an hour before finally bringing it under control, and once they were able to get inside, they made the discoveries everybody feared they'd make. Carrie Marie Murray had died. Her older sister, Anna Teresa Murray, had also lost her life, and Amanda Cooper, the eldest of the three, was pulled from the wreckage, alive but critically injured. She fought for weeks and the doctors did everything they could to save her, but the injuries she'd suffered were simply too severe. Around a month later, Amanda died in hospital. As daylight broke over Sanderson Avenue, the full scale of the destruction became clear. The front of the block was blackened by smoke. Windows had melted, and the entrance was little more than a charred shell. Fire investigators quickly established that this wasn't some tragic accident. It was clear that the fire had been started deliberately at the front door. In the hours and days after the fire, Irvine was left trying to understand how something so horrific could happen in such an ordinary place. Sanderson Avenue had gone from being a quiet residential street to the centre of a murder investigation. The community rallied around the survivors and the families of those who died. People brought flowers and dropped off food. Fundraisers were organised, and locals donated money to help those who had lost everything. Later tests carried out on an identical council-issued door to the one that was set ablaze showed just how quickly the material ignited. Once the flames took hold, there was almost no stopping them. Whoever had started the blaze had effectively turned the only escape route into a deadly trap. It didn't take long before detectives began asking themselves one very important question. Who would want to do something like this? For many people living on Sanderson Avenue, the answer came to mind almost immediately. One name kept cropping up again and again: Affleck. Detectives had already heard about his behaviour around Sanderson Avenue and knew that residents had complained about him several times. They knew there'd been incidents involving abuse, intimidation, and even threats. They also knew that, for whatever reason, he developed a deep hatred towards Diane and the people she associated with. Affleck was interviewed by the police and, unsurprisingly, denied any involvement. He claimed he'd nothing to do with the fire and maintained his innocence. But before long, someone came forward. His name was Scott Devine. Scott was 23 and had grown up with Affleck. They'd known each other for years, so that made what Scott had to say particularly important. In the immediate aftermath of the fire, Scott had actually been labelled a hero. During the rescue, as people gathered outside watching the flames tear through the building, Scott was the one who caught Diane's daughter when she was thrown from one of the windows. For a brief moment, amid one of the darkest nights Irvine had ever seen, he had been the person who stepped forward when somebody needed help. But behind the scenes, Scott was struggling with something else: fear. Initially, he gave police different accounts of what he'd seen that night. Later on, he explained he'd been terrified of Affleck. He knew his temper and what he was capable of, so he feared what might happen if he openly accused him of being responsible. Eventually, though, Scott decided he couldn't stay silent. He told detectives that he had seen Affleck running away from the scene of the fire. He said, "I'm certain it was Drew Affleck. I grew up with him. I've known him for years." For police, this was a significant development. But Scott wasn't the only person who claimed Affleck had admitted what he'd done. There was also his girlfriend. According to her, the confession came during a private conversation after the pair had taken drugs together. It wasn't a dramatic confession by any stretch, and there was no grand announcement. Affleck had simply asked her a question. "What would you say if I told you?" She replied that she would say nothing, and according to her evidence, Affleck then said, "It was me." But perhaps the most heartbreaking confrontation came when the mum of Carrie and Anna Teresa confronted Affleck herself. She had lost both of her daughters in one night. Two young girls who should have had their whole lives ahead of them. At some point after the fire, she saw Affleck in the street and approached him. She justifiably wanted answers, especially as to why he'd done it. Affleck's response would stay with her for the rest of her life. He told her, "I never murdered your weens," that means kids. "No one knew Anna and her wee sister were there." It wasn't just a denial. It was a statement that confirmed he knew exactly what had happened. And they weren't the only words that would come back to haunt Affleck. For months, people living in Sanderson Avenue had remembered his threats about burning people out. That anger towards those he blamed for the problems in the area. Investigators now believed those weren't just the ramblings of an angry and drunk man. They believed they were warnings. With that, Affleck was arrested and charged with 3 counts of murder and 3 counts of attempted murder. In November 2003, Affleck went on trial at the High Court in Kilmarnock. He maintained his innocence and insisted he wasn't responsible, which led to him entering a special defense of alibi. He claimed that on the night of the fire, he'd been asleep at his brother's house. He said he only woke up because he heard emergency sirens outside. His 22-year-old brother supported that version of events. The Crown's case, on the other hand, was straightforward. They argued that this wasn't an accident at all, and it wasn't a random act of vandalism that had gone horribly wrong. They said Affleck had carried out a deliberate act of revenge against Diane because of his obsession with her and his hatred towards the people he blamed for the problems in Sanderson Avenue. The prosecution described it as an act of vigilantism, a man who'd convinced himself that he was the one who needed to deal with the situation, because in his mind, nobody else was doing enough. But the reality of what happened that night was very different from whatever justification Affleck had created in his own head. The defense then attacked Scott's credibility as a witness, pointing to the fact that his initial statements to police had been inconsistent. They argued that his account had changed over time and questioned why he hadn't immediately told investigators what he later claimed to have seen. They also highlighted the fact that Scott was facing drug-related charges at the time and suggested this information could have affected how the jury viewed his evidence and questioned whether there were other reasons behind him coming forward. After considering everything, the jury reached their verdict. Affleck was found guilty of the murders of Carrie, Anna Teresa, and Amanda, and was also found guilty of attempting to murder Diane, Ainsley, and Alexander. The jury did not accept his claim that he'd been asleep at his brother's house. Affleck was cleared of 2 separate charges relating to earlier allegations of threatening behaviour and breach of the peace, but the primary charges remained. When it came time for sentencing, Lord Hardy delivered words that reflected the sheer horror of what had happened on Sanderson Avenue. He told Affleck, "Occasionally, very occasionally, there is a crime like this which comes into a special category of evil." Affleck was then handed a life sentence with a minimum term of 27 years, which would later be reduced to 23 years following an appeal relating to the sentence as opposed to the conviction itself. But don't get me wrong, Affleck did appeal his conviction, but it was swiftly rejected. Years later, though, a new legal battle began, and at the centre of it was Scott. In 2008, the Scottish Criminal Cases Review Commission looked into the case and referred it back to the appeal court. The issue wasn't that new evidence had proved Affleck innocent. Instead, the concern, once again, was whether important information had been withheld from the defence during the original trial. It related to the drug supply charges Scott himself was facing at the time, some of which were later dropped after he testified. Affleck's legal team argued that the full details of those charges should have been disclosed because they could have affected how Scott's evidence was challenged in court. The argument was that the jury should have known the full circumstances surrounding Scott's situation. Based on what I've read and my research, it seems like they were suggesting that Scott had testified in order to get some of his drug supply charges dropped. The case returned to the Scottish Court of Criminal Appeal in 2010, and 3 senior judges considered whether the non-disclosure had created a risk that Affleck had not received a fair trial. The court accepted that the full details had not been provided, but they concluded that it would have been reasonably clear to Affleck's legal team that Scott was facing proceedings. They ruled that the matter could have been explored during cross-examination and that there was no real risk of prejudice that would have made the trial unfair. The appeal was therefore refused. 25 years on from the fire on Sanderson Avenue, it remains one of the most shocking and heartbreaking crimes in Scotland's recent history. Thanks so much for listening to British Murders with Stuart Blues. A quick shout out to my newest Patreon members Astrid Butler, Ethan Scanlon and Ruth Sanderson. Thanks so much for joining my community. If you'd like to listen to the podcast without ads, get episodes a day early and access exclusive content not released on the main feed, you can support the show at patreon.com/British Murders. Following the podcast really helps the show continue to grow, as do ratings and reviews. They make a big difference as well. So thanks if you've left one or if you plan to. That's it for now. Until next time, cheerio.